The Supreme Court of Appeal has ruled that government departments cannot enter into contracts that exceed the amount appropriated for a particular service, as this ultimately renders that contract unlawful and constitutionally invalid. Now, the chairperson of Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts, that's Songezo Zibi, says this judgment, which was handed down on Friday, was significant and has far-reaching implications for government departments who apparently repeatedly enter into contracts for which they have no money. The chairperson of Scopa joins us now via our video link to discuss this and other related issues. And Songezo, it's great to have you on the SABC News channel. I'm tempted to say compliments because I think we say that around this time. And I hope you had a good rest.
It's a matter of habit.
Exactly.
I had a decent rest. Thank you.
Lovely, lovely. This is an important development, as I mentioned earlier on. Let me just gauge, given your experience in Parliament so far, how often you have found that, in fact, government departments typically do enter into these contracts, even though they simply don't have the money to see it through.
Look, I mean, this often shows up in the Auditor General's reports as an unlawful expenditure, which means they've spent money which was not appropriated. But that's a very broad term. There's many ways in which there can be unlawful expenditure, and this is one of them. But I will just give one example, which is a live example that viewers can refer to. The Department of Public Works in the Eastern Cape issued a communication in around November informing its real estate providers, that is, the people who provide offices to government in the Eastern Cape, that they will not be paid until the next financial year, that is in April, the end of April. And they need to talk to banks to make sure that they've got enough money to do maintenance and so on. That is exactly the kind of thing that this judgment says is unlawful, because you have government departments that have taken leases, or the Public Works Department has taken a lease for buildings and they don't have money for the rent. This judgment says the government simply cannot do that anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, unless I'm missing something, this to me sounds pretty logical. I mean, how do you make a commitment that you haven't been able to see through, if you know what I mean?
You know, it happens regularly. So, you know, South Africa is different to, say, countries like the United States, for instance. So in the United States, when there is a new law, and there's a infrastructure law or something recently in the United States, together with that law, you also have to appropriate the money in order to implement it. In South Africa, as a general rule, we have a law before there is money for it. And so this goes on and on and on. So it's not just pieces of legislation as a whole, but it is also, it extends to the commitments that then get made. There are also constitutional obligations that the government has for which there is no money as well, scholar transport and so on, where the money runs out, etc., etc. So this is a very important development because it forces Parliament and the government to begin having a different conversation about what budget is appropriated, what is possible to implement, and where costs need to be cut, where costs need to be cut, or where we need to cut waste and so on. But we can't keep doing this into perpetuity.
Absolutely, especially because we know the issues around the non-payment of suppliers have been long-standing across all levels of government. I can see in my head how a judgment like this could start addressing that issue. But the other thing that emerges then is government's ability then to continue fulfilling its mandate if, in fact, it can't enter into these agreements with suppliers for things like you've mentioned, like those scholar transport, for example, which are important.
Look, I think this is a very challenging reality, and I'm not certain if the Department of Defense, because that's where the litigation originated, in the Department of Defense and military veterans, whether they're going to take it to the Constitutional Court. But it forces Parliament and government to enter into a more disciplined conversation, because MPs in Parliament routinely demand that things need to be done by the government without any discussion whatsoever about whether the budget is going to be appropriated. And when the budget is presented by the finance minister with insufficient funds for the things that MPs and political parties have demanded, they approve it, which means Parliament itself is not doing its work properly. So Parliament needs to get into the habit of being conscious of how much money has been appropriated and therefore how much is possible and the commitments we then expect from the fiscals. Otherwise, we're all not doing our work properly.
Yeah, this judgment also points to accounting officers who, in fact, if they were to follow the PFMA, wouldn't have landed up in this situation to begin with. And I think in the litigation with the Defense Department, the acting, it might have been the DG, is cited in those papers. It brings me to a question around accountability, right? Whether there are individuals ultimately who can be held accountable in scenarios where essentially they're not following the rules of the law.
So I wouldn't blame the accounting officer to that extent, Ayanda, because you will remember there have been several incidents where veterans are fighting with the Minister of Defense, and then Minister of Defense, then Deputy President David Mabu said to get involved, if you will recall, because there were all of these issues with military veterans. So what happened is, what likely happened is that you had a political commitment to take care of veterans, and the accounting officer was asked to find the money. Because in the judgment, you will see that it caters for 14,000 veterans, for instance. Clearly, there was not enough money for 14,000 veterans. What needed to happen was for the Defense Department to say, we will be able to cater for, say, 7,000 instead of 14,000. But that would cause a political problem. So we need to examine the role played by the political heads of those departments as well. I think what you will most likely find is that the Director General was instructed to do this, and they had no choice but to do it.
Sure. It's one of the first few judgments of the year, and you and I have both agreed that it's an important one. And I suppose because of what comes with this time of the year, there's a lot of forward-looking. And with those conversations, there's considerations around what the president ought to prioritize in his expected first State of the Nation address under the Government of National Unity. Again, I'm going to ask you to wear your Scopa hat and not necessarily dictate to the president what should be his focus. But with this judgment in mind, I wonder how you reckon he could kind of start to begin to strike that balance to try adhere to it.
Look, there is a conversation, and I've had this discussion with the presidency, incidentally, specifically. There's going to be an ongoing discussion and regular reporting to Scopa by the presidency about value for money. The government pays for a lot of things. The finance minister said between 1.5 to 2 times for goods and services than you would get on the open market. That's unsustainable. You may well find that in many instances where there is no money, we can cover all the obligations or the majority of the obligations if the money is used well, the government pays good value for money and so on. The second discussion that we're going to have, or process that we're going to have with Scopa, is the strength and effectiveness of the internal audit functions and the audit committees right across departments and all the public entities, because that is where things fall apart. This kind of thing that resulted in a judgment, an audit committee should have caught years ago, but it didn't, which means the audit committee is ineffective.